The sun was a hammer on an anvil of tin sky, beating the Wyoming territory flat and dry. August had burned the prairie grasses to the color of old bone, and the wind, when it came, was not a relief but a scouring thing, carrying grit that stung the eyes and scoured the soul. It was a wind that whispered of endurance, not comfort. In the middle of this vast, sun-baked emptiness sat the town of Dry Creek, a place that seemed to have given up on the idea of being anything more than a single, dusty street. It had a saloon with swinging doors that groaned like a man in pain, a grain warehouse that smelled of dust and mice, a simple wooden church with a leaning steeple, and a marshal's office that looked more like a cage, far off, where the plains began to rise toward the Bighorn Mountains. A haze of smoke marked the summer encampment of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, a reminder of who had been here first and who remained, watching. Into this tableau of heat and dust walked Talon Greyhawk. He moved with a long, ground-eating stride that made no sound, a habit learned from years of walking on pine needles and stone. At 34, his face was a map of sun and wind, his dark eyes holding the stillness of a hawk watching from a high branch. He was of mixed blood, Cheyenne and white, a man who belonged fully to neither world and so had made his own in the high lonesome of the mountains. He had been a scout, a mountain man, a man who could read the story of a broken twig or a displaced stone. Now, he was just a man who wanted to be left alone. He carried a heavy bundle of prime beaver and fox pelts on his shoulder, the currency he would trade for salt, coffee, and cartridges. He came to town only when he had to, moving through its small commotion with a quiet intensity, his gaze missing nothing but engaging with no one. He saw the way men tensed as he passed, the mixture of fear and grudging respect in their eyes. He ignored it. Trouble was a fire he had long ago learned not to feed. He did his business at the general store, his words few and clipped. The proprietor, a man named Henderson, weighed his furs and counted out his supplies without much talk. Outside, the world of Dry Creek continued its slow, heat-drugged rhythm. A teamster cursed his mules with a creative flourish that was almost poetry. A crow perched on the warehouse roof offered a dry, mocking commentary. This was the town's music, a simple, unadorned tune of survival. As Talon stepped back onto the wooden boardwalk, shouldering his lighter pack, his eyes caught a flicker of movement on the porch of the grain warehouse. A woman was there, sitting at a small wooden desk, her head bent over a large ledger. She wore a dress of dark blue cotton, buttoned to the throat, a stark contrast to the endless brown and tan of the landscape. Her hair was the color of autumn honey, pinned up in a way that seemed to defy the wind's constant meddling. He saw the faint line of concentration between her brows, the way her fingers, stained with ink at the tips, moved down the column of figures. She must have felt his gaze, for she looked up. Her eyes were a clear, startling gray, like water over stones. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. In her eyes, he saw not the fear or suspicion he was used to, but a frank curiosity, a glimmer of intelligence, and something else, something deeper, a weariness that did not match her youth. He saw a resilience there, but also a profound solitude that echoed his own. Evelyn Hart felt the man's eyes on her before she saw him. It was a different kind of attention from the crude stares of the saloon patrons or the dismissive glances of the townsfolk. This was a look that was quiet, assessing, and complete. He stood tall and lean, dressed in buckskins that had molded to his frame. His face was hard but not cruel, and his dark eyes held a history she could not begin to guess. A wildness clung to him, not of savagery, but of a deep and abiding familiarity with places that had no names. A current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of two people on the edge of things, and then it was gone. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and turned, walking away down the dusty street without a backward glance. Evelyn watched him go, the image of his still, watchful face lingering in her mind, a strange feeling, like a single drop of rain on parched earth, settled in her chest. Talon did not look back. He had a rule. Etched into his soul by fire and loss, do not get involved. The woman was not his concern. Her troubles, whatever they were, belonged to her. As he cleared the last of the town's sorry buildings, his mind drifted back to the reason for that rule. He saw the face of his blood brother, Laughing Brook, saw the confusion in his eyes in that last moment. It had been a punitive expedition. The soldiers had called it retaliation for a raid that Laughing Brook's band had nothing to do with. Talon had been their scout, wearing the blue coat, believing he could be a bridge between two worlds. Instead, he had become a tool. He had led them there. He had heard the shots, smelled the powder, and seen the aftermath. The guilt was a stone in his gut, a weight he would carry until his own dying day. He had sworn an oath over his brother's body. Never again. He would never again be part of the white man's justice or his foolishness. He would walk his own path, alone. Later that evening, in the small room she'd rented above the saloon, Evelyn Hart confirmed her suspicions. The smell of stale beer and sweat drifted up through the floorboards, a constant reminder of where she was by the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp. She traced the figures in the warehouse ledger with a slim finger. The numbers were wrong. Small amounts at first. A sack of flour here, a bushel of corn there, all marked as spoiled or lost to weevils. But the discrepancies were growing larger, more audacious. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that this was theft on a grand scale. Silas Pike, the owner of the warehouse and half the town besides, was systematically robbing the local ranchers and farmers, the very people whose harvests he was meant to store. He was falsifying the records to cover his tracks, and his shadow, the man who enforced his will, was Marshall Cobb, a man whose smile never reached his cold, dead eyes. Evelyn was an orphan. Her parents had been taken by fever on the Missouri River when she was 16. Her aunt had raised her, a stern but fair woman who had insisted on her education. Reading, writing, and arithmetic, her aunt had said, were tools no one could take from you. Now, here on the frontier, she was finding that to be true. But her learning also showed her the depth of the corruption in Dry Creek. She was alone, a woman with no family and no protector, in a town run by thieves. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was a bedrock of stubbornness inherited from her aunt. She would not be a silent party to this injustice. After closing the ledger, she reached for the one true treasure she possessed. It was a heavy, leather-bound Bible, its cover worn smooth with age. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded, yellowed letter and a legal document. The letter was her aunt's last words to her, and the document was the deed to a small, abandoned homestead just outside of town, on a piece of land called Hart Creek. It had belonged to a distant uncle and was now hers. It was her only inheritance, her only hope for a life of her own. The paper was her claim, her anchor in this wild, uncertain land. She held the book to her chest, the promise of that small patch of earth a fragile shield against the growing darkness outside her window. Down the street, Talon Greyhawk made a cold camp just beyond the last glow of the town's lights. He sat with his back against a rock, watching the stars emerge in the vast, darkening sky. He could still see the woman's face, her clear gray eyes. He pushed the image away. She was part of the town, part of the world of fences and ledgers and laws that were lies. His world was the one of silent peaks and open sky, a world of freedom. But as he settled down to sleep, a coyote howled from a distant ridge, a lonely, mournful sound, and he wondered if his freedom was just another word for an empty life. In Dry Creek, under a roof that offered little safety, Evelyn Hart prayed for the courage to face the morning, her hand resting on a Bible that held the deed to a home she had never seen, a home she would have to fight for. The dry prairie wind blew between them, carrying the scent of dust and sage and the seeds of a storm that was yet to come. The morning air held a deceptive coolness that would be burned away by mid-morning. Evelyn Hart walked across the dusty street, the heavy warehouse ledger held tight in her arms like a shield. Her resolve, so firm in the lamplight of her room, felt brittle now under the vast, indifferent sky. The marshal's office was little more than a box of sun-warped planks. Inside, Marshal Cobb sat with his boots on his desk, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife. He looked up as she entered, his eyes the color of muddy water, taking in the ledger and then her face. A slow smile spread across his lips, a lazy, confident expression that made her skin crawl. She placed the ledger on the corner of his desk with a solid thud. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I believe you need to see this. Marshal, there are significant discrepancies in the warehouse accounts. Goods recorded as delivered to the ranchers never arrived. Tonnages are misreported. It amounts to theft on a large scale." Cobb did not bother to look at the book. He continued his work on his fingernails, the scrape of steel on the nail the only sound in the room for a long moment. "Is that so? Miss Hart discrepancies. That is a $5 word for a simple thing. Bookkeeping on the frontier ain't an exact science. Dust gets in the ink. Pages get smudged. A man makes mistakes." "These are not mistakes," she said, her voice gaining an edge of steel. "They are deliberate, systematic entries designed to defraud the people of this territory. And they are all signed and approved by Silas Pike." Cobb finally set the knife down, swinging his boots to the floor. He leaned forward, his smile gone, replaced by a look of bored paternalism. "Miss Hart, you are new here. You come from back east, where things are all neat and tidy. Out here, we have a more practical way of doing things. Silas Pike is a pillar of this community. He provides a service. Sometimes, that service comes with a cost. You understand." "I understand that a crime is a crime," she retorted, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "It is your duty to investigate it." "My duty," he said softly, rising from his chair and walking around the desk toward her, "is to keep the peace, and accusations against men like Mr. Pike, they disturb the peace." He stopped a foot from her, his voice dropping lower, a conspiratorial, greasy tone. "Now, a smart, pretty woman like you do not want to be a disturber of the peace. A woman alone has a hard enough time. Perhaps you and I could come to a private arrangement, an understanding. You find that your numbers were wrong after all, and I find a way to make sure you are looked after. Properly." The implication hung in the dusty air, thick and foul. Evelyn felt a surge of cold fury. She stood her ground, looking him directly in the eye. "There will be no arrangement. Marshal, I will not be silent. I will take this to the territorial judge when he makes his circuit." Cobb's face hardened, the last of his false charm vanishing like a puff of smoke. "The judge," he chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The judge is a long way from here. Miss Hart, a lot can happen on a long road. You think on that. Now get out of my office. You are wasting my time." Evelyn turned and left, her back straight, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not see the look in Cobb's eyes as he watched her go, a look of cold, calculating appraisal, like a man deciding the best way to crush an irritating insect. The rest of the day passed in a haze of dread. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in the shades of bruised purple and orange, Evelyn left the warehouse for the last time. The street was quieter now. She walked quickly, her senses on high alert. A few doors down, she heard the scrape of boots behind her. She glanced over her shoulder. Two men, rough-looking figures she recognized as Pike's men, had detached themselves from the shadows of the saloon porch and were following her. Her pace quickened. She turned a corner, into the narrow, refuse-strewn alley that ran behind the general store. It was a mistake. They blocked the entrance, their hulking shapes cutting off the last of the evening light. "The marshal said you needed a lesson in minding your own business," one of them grunted, his breath sour with whiskey. "We are just here to deliver the message," the other one added, showing a set of yellowed teeth in a grin. Evelyn backed away, her hand flying to her throat. She opened her mouth to scream, but a hand clamped over it. Just then, a sound from the other end of the alley, the soft scuff of a moccasin on hard-packed earth, made them freeze. Talon Greyhawk had heard the sound of pebbles skittering away from a hurried footstep. He had seen the woman turn into the alley, and he had seen the two men follow. It was not his business. He had repeated the words to himself, a familiar litany. Not his business, but his feet had moved of their own accord, carrying him into the shadows at the far end of the passage. He emerged now, a silent, menacing shape against the fading light. He did not speak. He did not need to. He moved with a speed that was startling, a blur of buckskin and dark fury, before the first man could even turn properly. Talon's fist connected with the side of his jaw. It was not a wild swing, but a short, precise blow that made a sound like a wet stick snapping. The man crumpled without a sound. The second man, stunned, let go of Evelyn and reached for the pistol tucked in his belt. He never cleared the holster. Talon's hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting. Bone grated. The man howled in pain as Talon spun him around, using his own momentum to slam him face first into the rough wooden wall of the store. He slid down into a heap, moaning. The entire encounter had taken less than 5 seconds. It was a display of brutal, economical violence. Talon stood over the two groaning men for a moment, his chest rising and falling. Then he turned his dark eyes on Evelyn. She was leaning against the wall, her hand over her mouth, her gray eyes wide with shock and a dawning gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. You saved me." Talon's face was a hard mask. He looked at her, then at the two men on the ground. He had broken his own rule. The anger he felt was directed at himself. He turned to leave, his long strides eating up the length of the alley. "Wait," she called after him. He stopped but did not turn around. "I just chase wolves from the pen," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I do not keep the sheep." Then he was gone, vanishing into the growing darkness as if he had never been there. That night, the fire started. Evelyn was jolted from a restless sleep by the sound of shouting, followed by the frantic clang of a bell. She ran to her window and saw it. The sky to the south was an angry, pulsing orange. The grain warehouse, her ledger, her proof, was in there. The whole town was awake, figures running through the street, their faces lit by the hellish glow. The warehouse burned with an impossible speed, the dry timber and tinder dry grain turning it into a funeral pyre. She watched, her heart sinking with the terrible, certain knowledge that this was no accident. They had not just destroyed the evidence, they had created a weapon to use against her. By dawn, the warehouse was a smoking, blackened skeleton. The whispers started almost immediately, fanned into flames by Cobb and his deputies. The bookkeeper. They said she was the one. Found out Pike was onto her stealing, so she burned the place down to cover her tracks. The story was simple, ugly, and for many of the fearful, frightened townspeople, it was believable. Her few allies knew better. Jesse, the blacksmith, a mountain of a man with a gentle heart, spat into the dust when he heard the rumors. May, the saloon proprietress, a woman with eyes that saw everything and a tongue that could strip paint, polished her glasses and watched Cobb with a look of pure contempt. But they were in the minority. Fear was a stronger currency than loyalty in Dry Creek. Just as the sun cleared the horizon, there was a quiet, urgent knock on Evelyn's door. It was May, her face grim. "Cobb has issued a warrant for your arrest," she said without preamble. "He is giving the town a little time to enjoy the spectacle, but he will be here to collect you within the hour." Evelyn felt the floor drop out from under her. "Arrest me for what? For arson, for theft, for whatever else he can think of. She is a dead woman if she lets him take her." "What can I do? Where can I go?" Evelyn asked, her mind racing. May pressed a small cloth bundle into her hands. Some bread, cheese, and a canteen of water. Listen to me. There is an old, abandoned homestead a few miles out of town, near a rock formation they call Lone Butte. It belonged to the Hart family once. You hide there. Lay low in the old barn until I can get word to you. It is your only chance." Evelyn looked at the older woman, her eyes flooding with tears. "Why are you helping me?" May's expression softened for just a moment. "Because I know a thing about bullies, child, and I know decency when I see it. Now go, out the back, and do not let anyone see you." This was it, the first true taste of being hunted. Evelyn grabbed her leather-bound Bible, the deed to that very homestead tucked safely inside. It felt like a sign, a desperate piece of hope. With a last grateful look at May, she slipped out the back door and into the gray, pre-dawn light. She ran, keeping to the shadows, her only thought to put distance between herself and the town that now wanted her blood. From his camp, Talon had seen the fire. He had known what it meant, an act of brutal punctuation to the events of the evening. It was a period at the end of a sentence that read, "We have the power." He had packed his few belongings, ready to head back to the mountains, to the clean, uncomplicated silence, but he hesitated. He walked to a small rise that overlooked the town and the plains beyond. And then he saw her, a small, solitary figure, moving fast, heading away from the town. He could not make out who it was from this distance, but he knew. He walked down to the path she had taken and knelt. In the soft dust, he saw the imprint of a woman's shoe, small, worn at the heel. The toes dug in from running. The tracks were fresh. They pointed directly toward Lone Butte. He stood up, a war raging inside him. Let her go. It was not his concern. He had his own ghost to live with. He did not need to take on hers. He turned his back on the tracks and took 2 steps toward the mountains, and then he stopped. An invisible thread, the one he had felt when he first saw her on the warehouse porch, pulled taut. He thought of her clear, steady eyes. He thought of her standing up to Cobb. He thought of her terror in the alley. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of bitter resignation, cursing himself, cursing the town, cursing whatever soft part of him had not yet been burned away. He turned and began to follow the small, desperate tracks into the wilderness. The darkness outside Dry Creek was absolute, a thick, starless blanket that swallowed the light and the land. For Evelyn Hart, it was a terrifying, living thing. Every rustle of the prairie grass was a footstep, every gust of wind a pursuing whisper. The mournful howl of a distant coyote sent a spear of ice through her heart, a lonely sound that echoed the desolation in her own soul. The sky, when the clouds parted for a moment, was a distant, cold glitter of stars, offering no warmth, no guidance. She ran, stumbled, and ran again, her lungs burning, her city shoes no match for the uneven, treacherous ground. Her flight was a blur of instinct and panic. In a patch of loose shale, her foot twisted beneath her. A sharp, searing pain shot up her leg, and she went down with a cry that the wind snatched from her lips. She lay in the dirt, gasping, tears of pain and frustration freezing on her cheeks. Her ankle throbbed with a sickening rhythm. For a moment, despair washed over her, a tide of hopelessness that threatened to drown her. She could give up. Lie here, let them find her. But the image of Marshall Cobb's leering face, of Silas Pike's cold avarice, rose in her mind. It was followed by the memory of her aunt's stern but loving gaze. "You are stronger than you think." Evelyn, her aunt's voice, a faint echo from a lifetime ago. With a grimace, Evelyn sat up. The pain in her ankle was sharp, but she could move her toes. Not broken. Then, a sprain, a bad one. Working through the pain, she reached under her dress and ripped a long strip from the hem of her petticoat. She wound it tightly around her ankle, pulling until the support was firm. The pain compressed into a dull, manageable ache. It was a clumsy, desperate act of self-preservation. She found a sturdy branch of sagebrush to use as a crude crutch and pulled herself back to her feet. She knew she needed water. May's canteen would not last forever. She remembered reading once, in a book about botany, that moss often grew on the damp side of rocks, a sign of hidden moisture. She began to scan the dark shapes around her, her panic giving way to a focused, methodical search. She found a small outcropping of rock and ran her hands over its cool surface, feeling for the telltale velvet of moss. Finding a patch, she dug with her fingers in the dirt at its base, her heart leaping when she felt the cold dampness of mud. She could not find a spring, but the knowledge that water was here, under the surface, was a small victory against the vast, dry wilderness. She limped on, favoring her injured leg, a small, hobbled figure moving through an immense and hostile world. Miles behind her, Talon Greyhawk moved with the silence and certainty of a phantom. The night that was a terror to her was a comfort to him. He read the story of her flight as easily as she would read a page in her ledger. Here, the blades of buffalo grass were bent unnaturally, all in the same direction, where she had pushed through. There, a small cascade of pebbles on a slope showed where her foot had slipped. He found a single kernel of corn near a rock, fallen from the small bag of supplies May had given her. It was a sign of her haste, her desperation. He did not need the light to see these things. He felt them through the soles of his moccasins. He smelled the bruised sage where she had fallen. His mother had taught him this language when he was a boy. "Listen to the earth," she would say in the soft cadence of the Cheyenne tongue. "It is always speaking. It will tell you who has passed, how they felt, where they are going. Now." The earth spoke of a woman's fear, of her pain, and of a courage she likely did not know she possessed. He moved with a relentless, loping stride, closing the distance between them, that invisible thread pulling him onward. The wind began to change. The steady prairie breeze turned fitful, then gusty, carrying a new scent, the sharp, mineral smell of deep dust. Talon lifted his head, sniffing the air like an animal. A storm was coming. Not rain, but wind, a sandstorm. He quickened his pace. Evelyn felt it too. The air grew thick, heavy. A low moaning sound started in the distance, growing steadily into a roar. The horizon, which had been a faint line between dark earth and darker sky, vanished. A wall of roiling, choking dust descended upon her. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath, blinding her. Grit filled her eyes, her mouth, her nose. The world became a maelstrom of sand and screaming wind. Disoriented, she lost all sense of direction. Lone Butte, her landmark, had disappeared. She was lost in a brown, howling chaos. Her crude crutch was ripped from her hand. She stumbled forward, pushed by the gale, knowing only that to stop was to be buried. Just as her strength was giving out, she tripped over something solid, not a rock, but a low, straight line of weathered wood, a fence post. She clung to it, and through the haze of dust, she saw a dark, hulking shape, a building, a barn. With the last of her energy, she fought her way toward it, her hands outstretched until they met the rough, splintered wood of a large door. She fumbled along its edge, searching for a latch, and her fingers closed around a heavy wooden bar. She pulled. It slid back with a groan of protest. The door swung inward, and she fell into the darkness beyond, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, the air inside still and thick with the scent of old hay and decay. She slid the bar back into its iron bracket, sealing herself in, shivering, half from cold and half from shock. She found a pile of old burlap sacks and a stiff, cracked leather saddle. She huddled beneath the sacks, pulling the saddle close for its meager warmth, and finally let the sobs come. Great. Wrenching gasps of fear and exhaustion in the sheltering dark. Back in Dry Creek, the sandstorm was an inconvenience. Not a cataclysm. Inside the marshal's office, a different kind of storm was brewing. Cobb stood before a sullen group of a half-dozen men, Pike's regular enforcers and a few local opportunists. The fire was God's own luck. Cobb was saying, his voice ringing with false piety. It proves what she is. She came here with her Eastern ways, her books and her numbers, trying to sow discord. She is a witch, I tell you, a poison in our midst. She consorted with that half-breed, then set fire to the town's livelihood to hide her sins. He let his words sink in, then leaned forward, his eyes glittering. Silas Pike has put up a reward. $50 silver for the man who brings her in, $50 for the woman who tried to ruin us all. I want her found before sunrise. Spread out. Check every line shack, every gully. She is on foot, and she is alone. The men's eyes lit up at the mention of money. Their doubts, if they had any, were washed away by greed. They filed out of the office, their boots thudding on the boardwalk, ready to become a hunting party. In the saloon, May watched them go, her face a mask of disgust. She met the eyes of Jesse the blacksmith across the room. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. Later, in the quiet of his forge, Jesse would wrap a spare rifle in a box of cartridges in oilcloth. In her kitchen, May would pack a small bag with bandages, laudanum, and a bar of soap. They were small acts of rebellion, of faith in a town that had lost its way. They did not know where the girl was, but they would be ready if she was found by the right people instead of the wrong ones. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air washed clean and a layer of fine silt on everything. The first hint of dawn was a pale, gray line in the east when Talon arrived at the Hart homestead. The place was a skeleton, a collapsed sod house, a broken corral fence, and the barn, still standing but listing to one side like a tired old man. He moved through the yard, his eyes scanning the ground. He saw the old tracks of shod horses, years old, but over them, he saw the new story, the small, frantic footprints, one of them dragging, leading directly to the barn door. He approached the structure in utter silence. He laid his palm flat against the weathered wood, feeling the grain, the deep cracks, and then he heard it, a faint sound from within, so soft he almost missed it, a choked, muffled sob, the sound of utter despair. His gut twisted. Here was the moment, the crossroads. He could turn around right now, walk away. No one would ever know he had been here. He could be back in the high mountains by noon, back where the world made sense, where a man's only promises were to himself. To get involved was to invite chaos, to risk everything for a stranger. The face of his brother, Laughing Brook, rose in his mind, clear and sharp with pain. He saw him lying in the dust, the blue-coated soldiers standing over him, their faces impassive. He had gotten involved then. He had tried to help, tried to be a bridge, and it had brought nothing but death and a guilt that gnawed at his soul. He had sworn an oath. Never again. He closed his eyes, his hand still resting on the door. He could feel the slight vibration of her weeping through the wood. He was a fool, a man drawn to a fire he knew would burn him. "Don't, Talon," he whispered to himself, the words a raw plea to the broken part of his own spirit. Not again. Another sob, this one sharper, a sound of a soul breaking. It cut through his resolve, through the wall he had built around his heart. It was the sound of a creature caught in a trap. He had chased wolves from the pen. He had told her. He had lied. He was standing right outside it. With a sigh that was a curse and a prayer, he wrapped his fingers around the wooden latch. He lifted it. The heavy wooden bar slid back with a groan that seemed to echo in the quiet dawn. The barn door swung inward, cutting a slice of pale gray light into the absolute blackness. Talon Greyhawk stood silhouetted in the opening, his form filling the space, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The air was thick with the dust of ages, the scent of hay that had long ago turned to powder. He saw her then, a small, huddled shape in the corner, half buried under a pile of filthy burlap sacks. Her shoulders were shaking with silent, exhausted sobs. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins and fell in a tangled cascade around her face. He took a slow step inside, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth floor. The movement, slight as it was, startled her. Her head snapped up, and her eyes, wide and luminous with fear in the dim light, fixed on him. They were swollen and red from weeping. A sound escaped her lips, not a scream, but a sharp, terrified gasp, the sound of a small creature cornered and expecting the final blow. That sound broke something deep inside him. It was a cry that bypassed all the walls he had built, all the oaths he had sworn to the ghost of his brother. It went straight to the core of him, to a place he thought had died long ago. In that instant, she was not a white woman, not a problem, not a complication in his solitary life. She was a human soul at the very edge of its endurance, and every instinct he possessed, every fiber of his being, rose up to answer that silent plea. Her cry made him risk his soul for her touch. He moved forward and knelt in front of her, slowly extending a hand not to grab, but to offer. He gently laid his fingers on her trembling shoulder. The contact was like a lightning strike. She flinched violently, but did not pull away. His touch was not threatening. It was firm, steady, and held an unexpected warmth. He said nothing, simply kept his hand there, a silent anchor in her sea of terror. Slowly, the violent trembling in her shoulders began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering weariness. "Let me see your ankle," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that did not seem to belong to the fierce man she had seen in the alley. She hesitated, then nodded. A small, jerky movement. She pushed the sacks away and extended her leg. The makeshift bandage was a dirty, twisted rag, and the ankle beneath it was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, a blotchy canvas of purple and blue. He worked with a surprising gentleness, his long, calloused fingers unwrapping the cloth with a surgeon's care. He probed the swollen flesh lightly, his touch assessing and impersonal. She winced, biting her lip to keep from crying out. "Do you have a license to practice medicine?" she asked, her voice raspy, a flicker of her old spirit trying to reassert itself. He glanced up, and for a second, she thought she saw a hint of a smile in his dark eyes. "No," he said, "just a license to survive." He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a clean strip of linen and a small tin. He opened the tin, and the sharp, clean scent of willow bark and something else, something minty and wild, filled the air. He smeared a thick, cool salve over her swollen ankle, his touch now surprisingly soothing. Then he wrapped the joint with the clean linen, his movements economical and precise, creating a binding that was both snug and supportive. "You need to leave this place," he said, his voice returning to its flat, hard tone as he finished his work. "Cobb will have men scouring this whole area. They will not stop until they find you." Evelyn pulled her leg back, testing the new bandage. The throbbing had already begun to recede into a dull ache. "No," she said, her voice stronger now, laced with a stubbornness that surprised even herself. "I will not be driven off. This is my land. Hart Creek. The deed is in my book. This is my home." Talon looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "This is a ruin," he said, his gesture taking in the decaying barn. "A piece of paper does not make a home, and a deed is no shield against a bullet. To demand justice, first you have to be alive. We need to go. Now." "I am not running anymore," she insisted, her chin set. "I have been running my whole life. This is where I make my stand." Before Talon could argue further, a sound from outside cut through the still morning air, the unmistakable drumming of horse hooves, moving at a steady trot, more than one, coming closer. Talon was on his feet in an instant, all traces of gentleness gone, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. He moved to a crack in the barn wall. Peering out, 5 riders. Cobb was not with them, but she recognized the man in the lead from the alley, the one whose wrist Talon had nearly broken. His arm was in a crude sling, and his face was a mask of sullen anger. They were in a trap. The barn had only the one large door. There was no back exit, no window large enough to climb through. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Evelyn again. Talon moved away from the wall, his eyes scanning the floor of the barn. His gaze stopped on a section of the floor where the packed earth was slightly darker, where a set of heavy, iron rings lay flush with the ground, a root cellar. He crossed to it in 2 silent strides, knelt, and pulled. The heavy wooden door lifted with a groan of protest, revealing a square of blackness and the smell of damp earth and old potatoes. "In here," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Quickly!" Evelyn scrambled over, her newly bandaged ankle protesting. He helped her down the short, steep ladder into the cool, musty dark. The cellar was small, barely large enough for 2 people to stand. He pulled the heavy door down, plunging them into near-total darkness. A few thin slivers of gray light filtered through the cracks between the floorboards above, just enough to make out their shapes. They stood in silence, listening. The sound of the horses grew louder, stopping just outside the barn. They heard the creak of leather saddles as the men dismounted. Heavy boots thudded on the ground. "Check the barn. It is the only structure standing." The lead man's voice, raw with anger, was sharp and clear. The great barn door slid open, flooding the space above them with light. Evelyn held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure they could hear it. They could hear the men walking around above, their boots kicking at loose boards, their voices muffled. "Smells like a tomb in here," one said. "Ain't nothing here but rats and ghosts," said another. They were right above them. Evelyn could smell the sweat of their horses, the stale whiskey on their breath, the acrid smoke of their cheap cigars. A heavy boot thudded on the cellar door, directly over her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying. "Wait!" The leader's voice was sharp. "Over here, tracks, leading right to the door. Small ones. A woman's." A silence fell, thick with menace. They knew. Talon put a single finger to his lips, though she could barely see him in the gloom. He was utterly still, a predator waiting. He reached over his shoulder and slowly, silently, drew the longbow from its buckskin sheath. He did not string an arrow. The cellar door creaked above them. A sliver of light widened as one of the men cautiously lifted it. A face appeared in the opening, bearded and grimy, eyes squinting into the darkness. Evelyn pressed herself back against the damp earth wall, a scream building in her throat. Before it could escape, Talon moved. He was not a man anymore, but a blur of silent, coiled motion. He reached up, his left hand grabbing the front of the man's shirt, pulling him off balance. The man grunted in surprise, toppling forward into the cellar, in the same fluid motion. Talon used the unstrung bow as a weapon, whipping the tough, flexible wood around the man's neck, pulling it tight. There was a choked gasp, a brief, frantic scrabbling of boots, and then the man went limp, his unconscious body slumping to the cellar floor. Talon laid him down gently, without a sound. It was over in 3 seconds. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes dark and unreadable. He had not killed the man. He had simply and efficiently removed the threat. A line had been drawn, a moral boundary she was just beginning to understand. What was that a voice called from above? "Did you find something? Jake!" Jake. The footsteps moved away from the cellar opening. "Must have gone outside to relieve himself," the voice grumbled. "Let's check the old house. She might be hiding in the foundation." The footsteps receded. The barn door slid shut again, and the semi-darkness returned. They waited. listening to the muffled sounds of the men searching the collapsed sod house. 10 minutes later, they heard them mount their horses. "Waste of time," the leader grumbled, his voice fading as they rode away. "She ain't here. Let's head east, toward the river." They waited in the silent darkness for a long time after the sound of the hooves had disappeared completely. The unconscious man on the floor began to stir with a low moan. "We cannot stay here," Talon said, his voice finally breaking the silence. "They will be back, or others will come." He was right. Her small act of defiance, her claim to this land, had failed. She was no match for them. "All right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He pushed the cellar door open and climbed out, then helped her up. He bound the still groggy man's hands and feet with a leather thong from his pack and propped him in a corner of the barn, a gag in his mouth. "He will wake up with a headache," Talon said, "but he will live." He gathered her small bundle and his own pack. "We will go to my camp, in the mountains. It is a hard climb, but you will be safe there. It is a place they will not think to look, and a place they could not find even if they did." As they prepared to leave the barn, stepping out into the now bright morning sun, Evelyn stumbled, her ankle giving way. Talon caught her, his arm wrapping around her waist to steady her. In the close, confined space of the dark cellar, their hands had brushed against each other as they stood waiting. A brief, accidental contact that had sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through her skin. Both had pulled back as if burned. But now, his touch was deliberate, supportive. The warmth was still there, a silent promise in the cold, dangerous world. She looked up at him, at his hard, unreadable face, and for the first time since fleeing Dry Creek, she felt a flicker not just of hope, but of trust. She was still a hunted woman, but she was no longer alone. The journey into the Bighorn Mountains was a punishing ordeal. The trail was not a trail at all, but a path that existed only in Talon Greyhawk's mind, a winding ascent through scree fields and dense pine forests. For Evelyn, every step was a fresh agony. Her ankle throbbed with a persistent, fiery beat, and her lungs, accustomed to the flatlands of Missouri, burned in the thin, high air. Yet, she did not complain. She gritted her teeth, her hand often resting on Talon's arm for support, and matched his relentless pace as best she could. She watched the way he moved, with an effortless grace that seemed to make the mountain yield to him. He was a part of this place, while she was a trespasser, loud and clumsy. He would stop for her when he saw her falter, his face impassive, and offer her a drink from his canteen without a word. The silence between them was vast, filled with the soughing of the wind through the pines and the sharp cry of a hawk circling high above. Late in the afternoon, they arrived. His home was not a cabin so much as a lean-to, built low against the sheltering face of a granite cliff. The walls were made of sturdy, notched logs, chinked with mud and moss, and the roof was a living carpet of sod and wildflowers. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a sign of life in the immense wilderness. Inside, the space was small and spare, dominated by a wide stone hearth where a fire burned low. A bed platform covered in thick furs and a brightly woven Cheyenne blanket took up one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and brewing tea. It was the scent of a sanctuary. An old woman sat by the fire, her back straight, her hands busy grinding herbs in a stone bowl. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her dark eyes holding a wisdom that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. She looked up as they entered, and her gaze, sharp and intelligent, moved from Talon to the exhausted, disheveled woman leaning on his arm. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips. "So," she said, her voice a low, musical rasp, "the mountain has sent you a visitor, nephew. Or did you finally find one worth climbing down for?" "This is Evelyn Hart," Talon said, ignoring the gentle barb. "She is in trouble. This is my aunt, Asha." Asha rose with a grace that defied her age and came toward them. She looked at Evelyn not with pity, but with a deep, assessing empathy. "Trouble finds all of us. Child," she said, "the question is what we do when it arrives. Let me see that leg." Over the next hour, Asha's quiet competence was a soothing balm. She examined Evelyn's ankle, her touch surprisingly strong and sure. She cleaned it with a warm, herbal infusion that smelled of wild mint and applied a fresh poultice of crushed yucca root and other powders she would not name. As she worked, she taught Evelyn how to identify the broad, spiky leaves of the yucca. "The root draws the fire out," she explained, her voice soft. "The leaves can be woven into cord, strong enough to hold a roof down in a high wind. The earth provides the cure for most of its own wounds, if you know how to ask." It was a simple, profound lesson, a moment of gentle connection between two women from different worlds, a quiet sharing of knowledge in the firelight. While Asha tended to Evelyn, Talon prepared a meal. He moved with a quiet efficiency, skinning a rabbit he had snared earlier and adding the meat to a pot of water already simmering over the fire. He added wild onions and roots from a basket by the hearth. The aroma of the rich stew slowly filled the small cabin, a smell of warmth and life and safety. When it was ready, he served it in 2 wooden bowls. Before he ate, he took a small piece of the meat and a spoonful of broth and went to the door, placing the offering on a flat stone just outside. He stood for a moment, head bowed, in a silent gesture of gratitude to the earth for its provision. Evelyn watched him, a lump forming in her throat. This fierce, silent man, who moved with such lethal grace, possessed a reverence she had only ever encountered in the pages of her Bible. Meanwhile, back in Dry Creek, the poison was spreading. Cobb, emboldened by his easy victory, used the story of Evelyn's flight to his full advantage. "The bookkeeper has run off with the half-breed greyhawk," he announced to the crowd gathered in front of the saloon. "She burned down the warehouse and is now taken up with a renegade, hiding in the hills like a coyote." He used the word redskin with a casual venom that made decent folk flinch. He is an enemy of this town, and anyone who shelters him or the woman is an enemy too. To give his words teeth, he tacked a new notice to the marshal's office door. A reward, $100, for the capture of Talon Greyhawk, dead or alive. But not everyone was swayed. In his small office, Deputy Nolan, a young man barely out of his teens with honest blue eyes and a jaw that had not yet been hardened by cynicism, felt a sour sickness in his stomach. He had seen the way Cobb and Pike operated. He knew the fire was too convenient, the accusations too swift. That evening, under the cover of darkness, he slipped out of the office and made his way to the back door of the saloon. He found May in her kitchen, her face grim. "It was an insurance fire," Nolan whispered, his words a nervous rush. "I saw the policy in Pike's desk drawer a week ago. He took it out just last month, for twice what that warehouse was worth. That ledger she had, it was the real reason. It proved he has been robbing everyone blind for years." May listened, her eyes narrowing. She nodded once, a gesture of grim understanding. "I will get word to Jesse," she said. "Be careful, son. These are dangerous waters you are stepping into." The next day, Talon's friend, Little Crow, rode into the high country. He led a small band of young Cheyenne warriors, their faces set and grim. They were not looking for a fight, but they were ready for one. He found Talon near a stream, cleaning a fish. They spoke in Cheyenne, their words flowing with the ease of long friendship. "Pike's men have been pushing," Little Crow said. "They drove a herd of cattle through our hunting grounds, scattered the deer. They fired shots over our camp last night, trying to spook the horses. They want a reaction. They want to provoke a fight, so Cobb has an excuse to drive us from the summer lands." Talon's hands stilled, his jaw tightened. "Tell the others to be patient. Do not give them the fight they want. To fight on their terms is to lose before the first arrow is flown." "Patience is a thin blanket in a cold wind," Little Crow replied, but he nodded. "For you, my friend, we will be patient." For now. But tell me, is it true what they say in the town? That you are sheltering the white woman who burned the warehouse? I am sheltering a woman who was falsely accused, Talon said, his voice flat. That is all. Little Crow looked at him for a long moment, his dark eyes perceptive. He had seen the extra blanket by the fire, the woman's shoes drying on the hearth. Be careful. Talon, he said softly. A woman can be a powerful medicine, sometimes healing, sometimes a fever that burns a man to the ground. He clasped Talon's shoulder, then turned and rode away, a silent warning left hanging in the crisp mountain air. The sanctuary of the mountains could not last. A few days later, Talon announced his decision. I can take you north, into Idaho territory, or west, to Utah. I know people who will help you. Give you a place to stay until you can start over. Evelyn, who had been gaining strength, her ankle now strong enough to bear her weight, looked at him, her gray eyes flashing. Start over, no. I am not running. Heart Creek is my home. The deed is legal. The land is mine. I will not be scared away by criminals like Pike and Cobb. Talon's patience, already worn thin by his worry, finally snapped. Your home is a pile of dirt, he said, his voice rising. Your deed is a piece of paper they will use to light a cigar. They tried to kill you once. They will not fail a second time. What you call a stand, I call suicide. Then what do you call this? She shot back, gesturing at the small, isolated cabin. Hiding is this freedom, Talon, to live alone, apart from everyone, because you are afraid of what might happen if you get involved. Her words struck him like a physical blow, hitting the raw, wounded place in his soul. He turned away from her, his face a mask of anguish. You do not understand, he said, his voice low and tight with a pain she could not comprehend. No, she said, her own voice softening. I do not, so tell me. But he could not. The ghost of Laughing Brook stood between them. That night, he sat by the fire long after she had gone to her bed of furs. Asha came and sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. The heart of that woman is strong, she said quietly, like a river that runs deep. She is a fool, he muttered. She will get herself killed. Asha was silent for a moment. Then she said, You are afraid. Not for her. You are afraid for yourself. You are afraid of the man you become when you care for someone. You think that caring is a weakness, that it leads only to pain. Your brother's death was a great stone that you have carried for too long, but you cannot honor his memory by closing your heart. A man becomes a man when he chooses what is right, not what is easy. Her words were simple, but they landed with the force of a revelation. He looked into the flames, seeing not just the past, but a possible future, a future where he did not run. The next morning, he did not speak of taking her to Utah. Instead, he took a short, stout mare from the small corral hidden in the trees. He showed Evelyn how to saddle the horse, how to hold the reins, how to sit deep in the saddle and move with the animal's rhythm. He taught her how to hold and fire the small rifle he kept in his cabin, how to aim, how to control her breathing, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. He showed her how to build a fire with a single spark from a flint and steel, how to find dry tinder even after a rain. She was a quick study, her mind sharp and her body surprisingly resilient. A quiet routine developed between them. Days were spent in the open, learning the practical grammar of survival. Evenings were spent in the small cabin, sharing the simple meals he prepared. They talked, not of the past or the future, but of small things. He told her the Cheyenne names for the stars. She read to him from her Bible, her voice a low, steady music in the firelight. The space between them, once a chasm of silence, began to fill with a quiet, comfortable understanding. Her sharp wit would occasionally make him smile, a rare, startling event that transformed his hard face. His dry, understated humor would catch her by surprise and make her laugh. A sound that felt like the first spring thaw in the cold. Lonely mountains. They were two solitary people, slowly, cautiously, learning the language of a shared life. The heart of a town is not its main street or its saloon. It is the secrets it keeps. In Dry Creek, the secrets were beginning to surface, not in a flood, but in dangerous, deliberate trickles. Jesse, the blacksmith, was a man who understood pressure and heat, the way to shape iron with fire and a heavy hammer. He applied the same principles to problems. Late one night, long after the last drunk had been thrown out of May's saloon, he moved through the shadows behind Silas Pike's office. The lock on the back window was cheap, and Jesse, who had likely forged the iron it was made from, knew its weaknesses. He was inside in less than a minute, a large, silent shadow in the moonlit room. He was not a thief, but he was on a thief's errand. May had told him what Deputy Nolan had whispered to her about the insurance policy. They needed more. He found it in a locked drawer of Pike's heavy oak desk. The lock was stronger, but Jesse had brought a thin, tempered steel pry bar he had forged himself. With a single sharp application of pressure, the wood splintered and the drawer popped open. Inside, beneath a stack of land deeds, was a rolled parchment. Jesse unrolled it carefully on the desk. It was a surveyor's map, beautifully drawn, showing a proposed route for a new spur of the railroad. The black line cut straight through the open prairie, directly across the summer grazing lands of the Cheyenne. And then, with an almost surgical precision, it bisected the small square of property marked Hart Creek. At the bottom of the map were two signatures. One, the elegant, looping script of Silas Pike, the other the crude, blocky signature of Marshall Cobb. The entire scheme was laid bare in ink and paper. This was never just about stolen grain. It was about land, water, and the iron path of progress that would crush anything in its way. At the same time, Deputy Nolan was engaged in his own quiet rebellion. He was a man of the law, and he believed in its power, even when its local representative was a fraud. Using his key, he let himself into the marshal's office when Cobb was away, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and righteousness. He painstakingly copied the details from the insurance contract on the warehouse, noting the date it was signed and the exorbitant amount of the policy. He also found a small notebook in which Pike kept his appointments. In it was a record of 3 separate meetings over the last 2 months with a man named Mr. Egan, noted down as a representative of the Union Pacific Railroad. The pieces were slotting together, forming a picture of cold, calculated greed. Nolan took his notes and the stolen map from Jesse and hid them beneath a loose floorboard in his own small room. A cache of truth in a town built on lies. The pressure Pike and Cobb were applying was not just on paper. It was being felt in the hills. The harassment of the Cheyenne camp had grown from a nuisance to a deliberate campaign of terror. One evening, as the sun was setting, a half-dozen of Pike's riders galloped past the encampment, firing their rifles into the tribe's precious horse herd. One mare went down, her legs shattered, and 2 other horses were wounded. The act was a profound violation, an attack not just on property, but on the lifeblood of the people. Little Crow, his face a mask of cold fury, rode to Talon's mountain sanctuary the next day. His patience had finally broken. "This is an act of war," he said, his voice tight with a rage that Talon understood completely. "They attack our women with their stares. They foul our streams with their cattle. And now they shoot our horses for sport. We must retaliate. We must show them that Cheyenne blood is not cheap." Talon listened, his own anger a hot coal in his gut. He looked at the faces of the young warriors with Little Crow, their eyes burning with the same fire. He knew that a single word from him would unleash a wave of violence that could not be recalled. He remembered another time, another fire, another rash act of retaliation that had led to disaster. "They want you to fight," Talon said, his voice quiet but firm. "They want you to raid a homestead or attack a wagon. They want you to give them an excuse to call in the soldiers and finish what they started years ago. If you fight by their rules, the lawless rules of the wild, you have already lost. We must fight with a different weapon." "What weapon?" Little Crow demanded. "A white man's prayer. The white man's law," Talon answered. "It is a crooked weapon. but sometimes it can be aimed straight. The information from Jesse and Nolan reached the mountain cabin through May, who sent a trusted ranch hand on a roundabout journey with a carefully worded message. That evening, the four of them, Talon, Evelyn, Asha, and the ranch hand, gathered around the small table. The stolen map was spread out, the damning evidence of Nolan's notes beside it. Evelyn looked at the documents, her bookkeeper's mind seeing the pattern, the cold logic of the crime. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with a new, hard-won confidence. "This is the proof. The ledger I kept showed the theft. The insurance policy shows the motive for the fire. And this map shows the reason for everything. They are trying to drive everyone out, Cheyenne and homesteader alike, to get this land for nothing." "But what can we do with it?" the ranch hand asked. "Cobb is the law, and Pike owns the town. Who do we show this to?" "We show it to everyone," Evelyn declared, a spark of inspiration in her eyes. "The town is holding a public meeting at the church in 3 days. They are voting to form a proper county council. It is the one place where the whole town will be gathered. It is a public forum, under territorial law. Any citizen can bring a grievance before the assembly. We will present all of it. The map, the insurance fraud, the story of the stolen grain. We will turn their own law against them." "It is a great risk," Talon said, his eyes fixed on her face. "Pike and Cobb will not stand by and let you expose them. They will have a dozen guns in that church." While they spoke, Asha, who had been listening intently, picked up Evelyn's worn Bible. She had been drawn to it before, feeling the weight of the history it contained. She ran her old, wise fingers over the inside back cover, where the deed to the Hart property was tucked. Her touch was light, sensitive, searching for something she was not even sure was there. Her fingertip paused on a faint, almost invisible indentation in the paper of the deed itself, near the signature of the territorial clerk. She carried it closer to the firelight, tilting it this way and that. "Here," she said, her quiet voice cutting through their strategic debate. "Look." They gathered around her. She pointed to the spot. At first, they saw nothing, but as she angled the paper just right, the firelight caught the faint, embossed outline of a seal, a circle containing an eagle and the words Territorial Land Grant Office, Official Registry. It was a mark of authenticity that could not be forged, a legal stamp that made the deed ironclad. "This paper is more than a claim," Asha said. "It is a recognized legal title. It proves that this land was granted, not just squatted upon. It gives you a standing they cannot easily dismiss." The plan began to form, a desperate, two-pronged strategy. It was too dangerous for all of them to simply walk into the church. "I will draw them out," Talon said. "I will make them believe I am making a raid on Pike's main ranch, south of town. Cobb will have to respond. He will take the bulk of his men with him, chasing a ghost. It will leave the town with only a few guards. That is when you will make your move." "You will go into the church," he said, his eyes on Evelyn. "May and Jesse will be with you. Nolan will be there to verify the documents as a deputy of the law. You will have your hearing." It was a plan born of desperation, a gamble where the stakes were their very lives. But it was the only path they could see that led not just to survival, but to justice. The night before they were to part, the air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken words. Asha had gone to her own small shelter to prepare medicines, leaving them alone. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, painting the small space in soft shades of orange and deep shadow. They sat on a bench by the hearth, not speaking, the silence comfortable, profound. Evelyn reached out and took his hand. His was rough and calloused, a hand that knew the feel of rock and rifle stock and reins. Hers was soft, but strong in its own way. He did not pull away. He turned his hand and laced his fingers through hers. "Freedom," she said softly, looking into the dying fire, "is not about being alone, is it?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at her, his dark eyes holding an emotion she had never seen in them before. A raw vulnerability, "I used to think it was," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I thought it was a wide-open horizon with no one to answer to. But I was wrong. It is just another word for empty." "Then what is it?" she asked. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. He then raised his eyes to meet hers and leaned forward until their foreheads touched. His other hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "Freedom," he said, "is having the right to stand next to the person you choose and not run." They stayed that way for a long time, foreheads touching, hands clasped, two solitary souls finding a shared center in the vast, silent wilderness. No more words were needed. It was a promise, a vow made in the quiet language of the heart. The next morning, they rose before the sun. The air was cold and still. As Talon saddled the mare for Evelyn's journey down the mountain to a rendezvous point with Jesse, he stopped. He pointed to the ground near the stream. In a patch of damp sand, clear and perfect, was a single, large paw print, the track of a lone wolf that had come to drink in the night. They both looked at it, this silent message from the wild. It was a beautiful, powerful, and lonely sign, an omen. Freedom had a price, and the time had come to pay it. The first sign of the trap was a plume of smoke, thick and black, rising from the south. Talon had set a fire in an abandoned line shack on the far edge of Silas Pike's vast rangeland, a deliberate and obvious provocation. From his perch high in a narrow, rock-strewn canyon the Cheyenne called Devil's Cut, he watched the response. It was exactly as he had anticipated. Marshal Cobb, consumed by arrogance and the promise of $100 bounty, rode out of Dry Creek at the head of a posse of 8 men, leaving only a handful of Pike's cronies to guard the town. They rode hard, their dust trail a rising brown serpent against the prairie, heading straight for the decoy. Talon settled into the rocks, becoming a part of the landscape. This canyon was his territory. He knew every ledge, every shadow, every ricochet angle. He was not here to kill. Killing was easy, and it solved nothing. It only fed the cycle of vengeance that had already cost him his brother. His goal was different. It was to disarm, to unmask, and to delay. He laid his rifle beside him, but took up his bow. It was the quieter weapon, the more precise tool for the surgery he intended to perform. When Cobb's posse entered the mouth of the canyon, Talon sent his first message. An arrow, fletched with hawk feathers, thrummed through the air and embedded itself deep in the thick pommel of Cobb's saddle. Inches from his thigh, the horse screamed and reared. Cobb fought for control, his face a mask of shocked fury. "Ambush," he roared. "Spread out, find the heathen." His men, a clumsy collection of saloon bullies and hired guns, scrambled for cover, firing their rifles wildly. Their bullets sparked and whined off the canyon walls, the reports echoing like cannon fire. They were shooting at shadows. Talon had already moved, ghosting along a high ledge to a new position. His second arrow took a rider in the fleshy part of his thigh. The man yelled and toppled from his horse. His fight over, a third arrow pinned another man's gun arm to the wooden stock of his own rifle. This was not a battle. It was a lesson in futility. Talon was a phantom, a whisper of death that never quite landed a fatal blow. He drove them deeper into the canyon, using their anger and frustration against them, making them waste their ammunition, fraying their nerves. Finally, Cobb, his face purple with rage, saw a flicker of movement high above. "There he is," Cobb bellowed, his voice cracking. He raised his own rifle and fired. The bullet tugged at the sleeve of Talon's buckskin shirt. Too close. The game had to end. Talon used his last arrow to disable another man's horse, then switched to his rifle. He did not aim for a man, but for a large, precariously balanced rock formation above Cobb's position. He fired once. The bullet struck the base of the formation, and with a great groan, tons of rock and shale slid down the canyon wall. creating an impassable barrier of rubble that separated Cobb and two of his men from the rest of the posse. Now the odds were even enough. Talon let out a high, piercing Cheyenne war cry, a sound that bounced off the canyon walls, multiplying until it sounded like a dozen men were attacking.
"It is a war party,"
one of the men with Cobb shrieked, his eyes wide with terror. Cobb had lost all control. His face was a contorted mask of hatred. "Shoot them," he screamed, firing his pistol blindly at the rocks. "Shoot all the savages, kill them all." He was not giving orders to his men. He was screaming at ghosts, at the phantoms of his own prejudice, his primal fear of the people whose land this was. While the mountains echoed with the sound of Cobb's madness, the town of Dry Creek held its breath. The small wooden church was packed to capacity, the air thick with the smell of unwashed wool, dust, and nervous sweat. Evelyn Hart stood at the front, before a makeshift table where 3 of the town's elders sat, looking uncomfortable. In her hands, she held the warehouse ledger. Her hands were trembling, her throat as dry as the street outside. Then she looked out at the faces before her. She saw the fearful, the uncertain, the hostile, but she also saw May, sitting in the front pew, giving her a small, fierce nod of encouragement. She saw Jesse, his massive arms crossed over his chest, his presence a silent promise of protection. She saw Deputy Nolan, standing by the door, his young face pale but resolute. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice, though quiet at first, did not waver. It filled the silent church. She began with the ledger, her bookkeeper's training giving her a calm authority. She explained the false entries, the stolen grain, the systematic theft that had been bleeding them all dry. Then she unrolled the railroad map. A collective gasp went through the room as they saw the black line cutting across their lands, their hopes. May and Jesse both stood to confirm her story, their plain, honest words carrying more weight than any official document. Finally, Nolan stepped forward. "I have seen the insurance policy on the warehouse," he announced, his voice cracking slightly before finding its strength. It was taken out 1 month before the fire, for an amount far exceeding its value. This was not arson by Miss Hart. It was fraud by Silas Pike. The words had barely left his lips when the church doors burst open. Silas Pike stood there, his face a thundercloud of fury. Behind him were the 4 men he had left to guard the town. "This is an illegal assembly," Pike roared, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "This meeting is over." His men started forward, their hands on their pistols, but Deputy Nolan, a boy playing a man's game, found the man within himself. He stepped in front of them, his hands so shaky he could barely unholster his own pistol. He held up his tin star, a small, pathetic shield against the coming storm. "By the authority of the Wyoming Territory," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "This is a legal public hearing. You will not interfere." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Get out of the way, boy, before you get hurt." He shoved Nolan aside. And then the chaos erupted. One of Pike's men lunged for the map on the table. Jesse intercepted him with a forearm like a timber beam, sending him crashing into a pew. Another man threw a punch at a rancher, who fought back with a fury born of desperation. A stained glass window depicting a peaceful shepherd shattered, showering the floor with colored jewels of glass. Someone grabbed the bell rope, and the church bell began to clang wildly. A frantic, dissonant alarm. Asha, who had been sitting quietly at the back, moved with calm purpose, gathering the terrified women and children and shepherding them into the small vestry behind the altar. In the confusion, one of the thugs grabbed Evelyn's arm. She cried out, but as he tried to drag her toward the door, her fear was consumed by a white-hot rage. She was no longer the frightened woman who had hidden in a barn. She twisted out of his grip, snatched a heavy brass candlestick from the altar, and swung it with all her might. The candlestick connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the floor. High in the canyon, Talon had cornered Cobb, The fight was short and brutal. Cobb was a bully, not a fighter. Talon disarmed him easily, the two men grappling in the dust. A lucky shot from one of Cobb's remaining men grazed Talon's side, a hot, searing line of pain, ignoring it. Talon slammed Cobb against a rock wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. With his free hand, he reached up and ripped the tin star from Cobb's vest. He looked at it. It was a cheap piece of metal, poorly made, with no official markings. It was a fake. "You are not a marshal." Talon grunted, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. You were never the law. He left Cobb and his men there, tied up with their own belts. He leaped onto his horse and galloped out of the canyon, the pain in his side a dull fire. He rode with a desperate urgency, the wild clang of the church bell reaching him on the wind, a sound of disaster. He spurred his horse on, the animal's hooves devouring the miles, a cloud of dust rising behind him. He arrived at the church just as the riot inside had reached its peak. He saw Evelyn, standing near the altar, her face smudged with dirt, a brass candlestick clutched in her hand like a weapon. He saw the blood on his own shirt, the chaos in the house of God. Their eyes met across the brawling room, a silent, desperate connection. Silas Pike saw it too. He saw the wounded half-breed in the doorway. He saw the woman who had ruined him. His face contorted with hate. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim not at the man who was the greater physical threat, but at the woman who was the source of his undoing. Evelyn Talon's voice was a raw shout. He launched himself from the doorway, covering the distance in 3 desperate strides. He did not think. He only reacted. His body moving to intercept the path of the bullet meant for her. He threw himself in front of her, a human shield. The world exploded in a starburst of white-hot pain as the bullet slammed into his left shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered, the force of the impact driving him to his knees. But he was still between her and the gun. He had risked his life for her. He had taken the bullet that was her name. The gunshot shocked the room into a moment of silence. In that silence, a second shot rang out. Deputy Nolan, his face white, his hand now steady, stood with his pistol smoking. Silas Pike screamed and dropped his gun, clutching a hand that was now a mangled ruin of blood and shattered bone. That was the moment the tide turned. The sight of Pike, the untouchable tyrant, screaming on the floor, broke the spell of fear that had held Dry Creek captive for so long. The ranchers, the farmers, the townspeople surged forward. They overwhelmed Pike's remaining men, not with guns, but with the sheer weight of their numbers and their long-suppressed rage. Jesse the blacksmith pushed through the crowd. He ignored the handcuffs hanging from Nolan's belt. Instead, he unhooked a heavy iron horse chain from his own belt and used it to bind Silas Pike's hands behind his back. As Jesse pulled the chain tight, May stepped forward, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the suddenly silent church. "Silas Pike," she declared, her words the first draft of a new law. "You stand accused of theft, fraud, arson, and attempted murder by the people of this town." Justice had not come from a man with a tin star. It had risen from the floorboards of the church, born from the courage of a woman with a ledger and the collective will of a people who had finally decided they had had enough. The smoke had not yet cleared, but the silence that followed the chaos in the church was more profound than any noise. Dr. Miller, a man whose hands were more accustomed to delivering babies and setting farmers' bones, worked with a focused intensity. His small surgery smelled of carbolic acid and stale coffee. Talon sat on the edge of the examination table, stripped to the waist, his face pale beneath its tan, but otherwise as still as the granite cliffs of his home. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his shoulder, a painful but blessedly lucky wound. Evelyn stood beside him, holding a clean basin of water for the doctor. She refused to leave his side when the doctor threaded his needle with gut, preparing to stitch the torn flesh. She reached out and took Talon's free hand. His fingers, calloused and strong, closed around hers, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. The needle dipped and rose, a grim and repetitive motion. Talon did not flinch, but his grip on her hand tightened with each stitch. To break the tense silence, she leaned closer, her voice a low murmur only he could hear. "You know, you owe me a proper rabbit stew for this." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I am a terrible cook," he said, his voice a strained rasp. She managed a small, watery smile. "Then I will teach you." She felt his fingers relax slightly in her grasp. The simple, absurd promise of a future cooking lesson was an anchor in the painful present, a quiet defiance of the violence they had just survived. While the doctor worked, the town began to piece itself together. Deputy Nolan, his boyish face set with a new and solemn gravity, spent the entire night writing. He documented everything, his neat handwriting filling page after page with the details of Pike's fraud, the false marshal, the fire, the attack in the church. He compiled the testimony of May and Jesse and the sworn statements of a dozen other ranchers who now felt safe enough to speak. At dawn, he sent the entire dossier with a trusted writer to the district judge in Cheyenne, along with an urgent telegraph message. The reply came 2 days later, the clatter of the telegraph key drawing a small crowd to the station. The operator, a nervous man named Finch, read the message aloud, his voice gaining strength with each word. The name of Harrison Cobb was unknown to the United States Marshal Service. The territorial seal on his warrant was a forgery. Federal warrants for felony charges of fraud, conspiracy, and impersonating a federal officer were being issued for both Cobb and Pike. A real United States Marshal was on his way. A new kind of law, one with teeth and legitimacy, was finally coming to Dry Creek. The following Sunday, the town gathered again at the church. The shattered window was boarded up, the floors scrubbed clean of blood, but the memory of the violence lingered. This time, however, the atmosphere was not one of fear, but of sober resolution. Deputy Nolan, standing where the altar had been, read the official pronouncement from the district judge, based on the embossed territorial seal, which had been verified by the land office. The deed held by Miss Evelyn Hart was declared valid and incontestable. The ownership of Hart Creek was hers, and hers alone. When he finished, a sound went through the church. It was not a loud cheer or a triumphant roar. It was the sound of hands coming together, a slow, sustained applause that was less a celebration and more a collective sigh of relief. It was the sound of a community beginning to heal, of a quiet and deeply held belief in justice being restored. In the days that followed, that healing took practical forms. Little Crow came down from the high country, not with warriors painted for battle, but with the elders of his band. He met with Nolan, May, and the newly formed town council. "There was talk of revenge in my camp," Little Crow said, his voice calm and measured. "There were many who wanted blood for our stolen lands and our slain horses. But Talon Greyhawk was right. To fight with their weapons is to become like them." Instead, he made a proposal, a formal treaty to be written and signed by both the town and the Cheyenne, an agreement for shared use of the high prairie during the dry season, a compact to share the precious water of the creek that ran through both their lands. It was not a demand, but an offer of coexistence, a pragmatic step away from the cycle of violence. May, who the town had unofficially and unanimously elected as their leader, began to forge a new order from the ashes of the old. Meetings were held in her saloon, the long bar now a table for drafting bylaws instead of serving whiskey. They formed a Citizens Defense Council, establishing clear rules and fair wages for patrols. Jesse the blacksmith was put in charge of public works, a title that made the big man blush, but which he accepted with a solemn nod. He began by forging new, stronger locks for the jailhouse, then moved on to repairing the church bell, and then started organizing work crews to build a new bridge over the creek. The town was not just rebuilding what it had lost. It was building something better. Talon recovered his strength in the quiet solitude of Asha's care. The wound in his shoulder healed, but the older wounds in his soul were slower to mend. One evening, as he sat by the fire, the guilt he had carried for so long rose up, a familiar, choking tide. He had saved Evelyn, but he had failed to save his brother. Asha, seeing the torment in his eyes, sat beside him. "You think this one act has washed away the past," she said, her voice soft. "You think one victory makes you clean." He did not answer, his silence a confession. "Redemption," she told him, her hand resting on his good shoulder, "is not a single, grand battle. It is not a debt that can be paid in one moment of courage. Redemption is the way you live each day that follows. It is the patience you show to a frightened horse, the truth you speak to a friend, the kindness you offer to a stranger. It is the house you build, not the one you burn. You did not fail your brother. Talon, you have just begun to truly honor him." Her words were a gentle rain on the hard, dry ground of his grief. For the first time, he felt the stone in his gut begin to dissolve, not vanishing, but becoming a part of him he could carry without being crushed by its weight. A week later, he walked with Evelyn to Hart Creek. The land was beautiful, a gentle sweep of prairie grass and wildflowers leading down to a stream lined with cottonwood trees. The abandoned barn stood against the sky, its weathered wood turned silver by the sun. It was no longer a place of terror, but a place of promise. She walked to the great barn door, the one she had barred from the inside in her desperation. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and slid the heavy bar aside. She pulled the door open. A cascade of golden afternoon sunlight poured into the dusty interior, cutting through the gloom in brilliant, angelic shafts, motes of dust. Disturbed for the first time in years, danced in the light like tiny stars. The air smelled of dry hay, old leather, and the rich, dark earth. It was the smell of a new beginning, a quiet, profound moment of resurrection that needed no words. He stood back, watching her. She turned, her face illuminated by the light streaming from the barn, her gray eyes soft. She walked to him, her steps sure and confident on the land that was now truly hers. She stood before him, so close he could feel the warmth of her skin. She reached up and gently touched the new, pink scar on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "There are no words for what you did." He looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with a tenderness he no longer tried to hide. He slowly lowered his head, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She rose on her toes to meet him. Their first kiss was not a thing of fire and passion, but of quiet reverence. It was long enough to be a profound expression of gratitude, a thank you for a life returned, and it was short enough to be a promise of the gentle respect with which they would begin to build a new life, together, on this piece of healed and hallowed ground. The season turned with a sudden, violent mood swing. The long, dry summer that had baked the prairie to a brittle crust gave way not to a gentle autumn, but to a week of sullen, gray rain. The sky was the color of a lead slug, and the air, once thin and sharp, grew heavy and humid. The earth, baked hard by the summer, could not drink it all. The water ran in rivulets, then streams, then torrents, carving new paths through the dusty soil. The gentle ribbon of Hart Creek, which had been a source of life and promise, began to swell. Talon saw the danger before anyone else. He stood on the rise behind the barn, watching the creek churn. Its waters no longer clear, but a thick, ugly brown, carrying branches and debris. He smelled the change in the air, the scent of wet earth and torn roots. His eyes were fixed on the small, man-made earthen dam a half-mile upstream, a relic from the homestead's original builders, designed to create a small reservoir for irrigation. Now, that dam was under a strain it was never meant to bear. The water was already licking at its top, If it broke, a wall of water would sweep down the shallow valley, and everything they had begun to build, the barn, the new corral, the tilled garden plot, would be washed away. He did not waste time with debate. He rode hard into Dry Creek, the mud sucking at his horse's hooves. He found Jesse at the forge and May at the saloon. "The dam is failing," he said, his words clipped and urgent. "We need every able-bodied man, now." What followed was a testament to the town's transformation. There was no argument, no hesitation. Jesse dropped his hammer. May untied her apron. The church bell, once a frantic alarm of violence, now rang with a steady, purposeful rhythm, calling the community to a different kind of battle. The men of the town, ranchers and shopkeepers who had once looked at Talon with suspicion, now looked to him for leadership. He organized them into work crews with an economy of words, his deep knowledge of the land and its forces now a vital community asset. Evelyn, seeing the men gather their shovels and axes, knew her place was not on the front line of the dam. Her barn became the nerve center of the operation. She directed the women, organizing them to fill burlap sacks with sand and dirt from the driest part of the property. Her mind, so adept at bringing order to columns of numbers, now brought order to chaos. She kept a steady supply of sacks moving to the front line, organized a station for fresh water and hot coffee, and directed the older children to look after the younger ones inside the relative safety of the newly repaired Hart House. She was no longer a victim hiding from a storm. She was a commander holding the line. Little Crow arrived with a dozen of his young men, not with weapons, but with their own shovels, joining the line of townsfolk without a word, their shared struggle against the rising water a more powerful treaty than any piece of paper. In the midst of this natural crisis, a human one was unfolding in the Dry Creek jail. Silas Pike, his hand bandaged, his arrogance undiminished even by his iron chains, saw the chaos as an opportunity. The jail was run by an old, weary man named Finch, a man whose loyalty had always been for sale to the highest bidder. Pike worked on him, his voice a low, seductive whisper. "The town is falling apart. Finch, when that dam breaks, this whole place will be washed away. But I have money, a lot of it, buried where no one will ever find it. $1,000 in gold coin. Help me get out of this cell, and half of it is yours." Deputy Nolan arrived to bring the prisoners their meager evening meal and found Finch fumbling with the keys to Pike's cell. The old man's face was slick with a cold sweat, his eyes darting nervously. Nolan knew instantly what was happening. He could have looked the other way. He could have walked out, let Pike escape, and avoided a dangerous confrontation, a life of looking the other way, of taking the easy path, stretched out before him as a powerful temptation. But then he felt the weight of the tin star on his chest. It was real now. He had earned it. He drew his pistol, his hand steady. "Step away from that door." "Finch," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the cold weight of the law. Finch froze, the keys rattling in his hand, Pike's face, visible through the bars, contorted in a snarl of fury. "Do not be a fool," Boy Pike hissed. "This is your one chance to be a rich man." Nolan's gaze did not waver from the old guard. "I took an oath," he said, more to himself than to them. He gestured with his pistol. "Open the cell next to Pike's." Finch, his face ashen, fumbled with the keys and opened the empty cell. "Now get in." Finch stared at him, dumbfounded. Nolan cocked the hammer of his pistol. The sharp click echoed in the small, damp room. "Now." Finch, his shoulders slumping in defeat, shuffled into the empty cell. Nolan took the keys, locked the door, and then walked over to Pike's cell. He looked the once powerful man in the eye. "You will stand trial, Pike. That is the law." He then turned and walked out, leaving both the criminal and the man he had tried to corrupt locked in the echoing silence. At the dam, the situation was growing desperate. The water was now streaming over the top, eating away at the soft earth. A section near the middle began to crumble, a fissure widening with each passing moment. It was about to go.
There is no time to bring more sandbags,
Talon yelled over the roar of the water.
We have to brace it from the other side.
The other side was a maelstrom of ice-cold, churning water. To be swept away was certain death. Give me the rope, Talon shouted to Jesse. He tied one end around his waist. I need to get a stake in on that far bank, to anchor a log. You will not make it alone, a voice said at his side. It was Evelyn. Her face was streaked with mud, her hair plastered to her head, but her eyes were clear and determined. He started to argue, to order her back, but he saw the look on her face and knew it was useless. They had come too far to be separated now. Without another word, he tied the other end of the rope around her waist. A desperate, binding act. We go together, he said. They plunged into the torrent. The shock of the cold stole their breath. The current was a physical beast, trying to rip them away, to drag them under. They fought it, not as heroes, but as two desperate human beings, their muscles screaming, their lungs burning. Talon, stronger and more familiar with the water, went first, breaking the main force of the current. Evelyn followed in his wake, clinging to the rope, her feet finding purchase on the slick, rocky bottom. They made it to the other side, collapsing on the muddy bank, gasping for air. They worked in a frantic, synchronized rhythm, driving stakes deep into the bank, using the rope to haul a heavy log into place, bracing the weakening section of the dam. It was a crude, desperate fix. But as the other men cheered from the far bank, they saw that it was holding. The fissure had stopped widening. They held the line for another hour. And then, as if a great switch had been thrown, the rain stopped. The sky to the west began to clear, and a sliver of pale, watery sunlight broke through the clouds. The flood had crested. The roar of the creek began to subside. Its fury spent. They had held. That night, the community gathered at the Hart Barn. The ground was a sea of mud, but no one cared. Jesse had built a huge bonfire in the yard, its flames leaping toward the newly cleared, star-dusted sky. A rancher played a sweet, simple melody on a harmonica, a sound of quiet triumph. The firelight danced on the faces of the people gathered around, a mix of white settlers and Cheyenne, their faces weary, muddy, but filled with a strange and quiet sense of renewal. They had faced a common enemy, and they had won. Their fragile treaty of paper and ink had been reforged in mud and water and shared struggle. Asha, her serene face glowing in the firelight, moved to the center of the circle. She told an old story, a Cheyenne tale of how the Creator had given the people the horse to be their legs, the buffalo to be their food, and the community to be their heart. As she spoke, the children, both white and Cheyenne, fell asleep on piles of blankets, their heads pillowed on saddles, their small rivalries forgotten in a shared exhaustion. When the story was over, Asha came to where Talon and Evelyn stood. She held a thin, tightly woven braid of dark hair, bound with threads of red and blue. She held it out to Talon. "This was from your mother's hair," she said softly. "A piece of our family, a tie that binds." Talon took it, his hand trembling slightly, and held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Then Asha turned to Evelyn. Her dark, wise eyes were filled with a deep and gentle warmth. "You have the heart of a mountain woman," she said. "You stood your ground. You cared for the people. You belong here." With that, she reached out and gently touched Evelyn's cheek, a simple gesture of acceptance that was more powerful than any words. Later, when the crowd had begun to thin and the fire had burned down to a great, glowing heart of embers, Talon and Evelyn walked away from the light. They stood by the banks of the creek, which was now murmuring peacefully, its rage forgotten. He took her hands in his. "I used to think freedom was the horizon," he said, his voice a low whisper in the quiet night, always moving, never tied down, I thought a home was a cage. Turns out, it is a home with you in it." She looked up at him, her heart so full she thought it might break. She reached up and touched the scar on his shoulder, then his face, her fingers tracing the hard, beloved lines of it. "I used to think my virtue was a thing to be guarded," she answered, her own voice barely a whisper, a wall built out of fear. "But I was wrong. It is not about fear. It is the courage to love the right person at the right time." The arrival of United States Marshal Thompson was a quiet affair, a stark contrast to the loud, fraudulent authority of Harrison Cobb. Thompson was a tall, lean man with a sun-weathered face and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. He rode into Dry Creek alone, his demeanor calm and professional. He reviewed Deputy Nolan's meticulous report, listened to the testimonies of the townspeople, and examined the evidence with a practiced eye. Within a week, the final pieces of the old, corrupt order were swept away. Silas Pike and his cronies, along with the disgraced Finch, were taken away in a prison wagon, bound for the federal court in Cheyenne. The Telegraph brought news that Cobb and his remaining men had been apprehended by a patrol out of Fort Laramie. The charges were extensive conspiracy, fraud, impersonating an officer of the law, and attempted murder. The law, once a tool of oppression in Dry Creek, had finally become an instrument of justice. Before he left, Marshal Thompson performed his last official act in the town, in a brief ceremony on the steps of the now-repaired church. He formally removed the word deputy from Nolan's title. "Town Marshal Nolan," he announced, his voice carrying in the clear autumn air, a position earned not by appointment, but by courage. Nolan, his face flushing with a mixture of pride and profound humility, accepted the new, real badge, its polished silver seeming to hold the weight of all their shared struggles and hopes. The spirit of cooperation, forged in the face of the flood, now took on a more permanent form. On a bright, cool afternoon, the new Dry Creek Town Council met with Little Crow and the Cheyenne elders on the banks of Hart Creek. The treaty they had drafted was simple, its language plain and direct. It established shared grazing rights on the high prairie and guaranteed access to the creek for both communities, with rules for conservation that showed a newfound respect for the land. After the document was signed by May on behalf of the town and Little Crow with his thumbprint and tribal mark, they set a date for a joint harvest fair. It was a simple, practical step toward turning strangers into neighbors, a way to replace a history of fear with a future of shared festivals and common ground. Evelyn's barn, once a place of terror and refuge, was reborn as the heart of the new Hart Creek homestead. It was no longer just a barn, but a proper trading post and grain store, founded on the principle of honesty. Jesse, in his forge, had crafted a beautiful sign for her, not of painted wood, but of hammered iron. The letters were clean and strong, and beneath the name Hart Creek Provisions, he had added a simple motto that captured the spirit of the new enterprise: fair weight, fair word. She hung it proudly over the wide barn doors, a public promise to the community she had helped to save and which, in turn, had saved her. While Evelyn brought the inside of the barn to life, Talon worked to restore its bones. He replaced the rotten timbers, patched the leaking roof, and rebuilt the collapsed corral with sturdy new posts. He worked with a quiet, focused energy, the simple, honest labor a healing balm for his soul. When the structural work was done, he took out his carving knife, high on the main crossbeam above the doors. He spent an entire afternoon carving a symbol. It was an image from his own heritage, a hand, open in a gesture of peace and friendship, crossed with a single arrow. The arrow, he explained to Evelyn later, did not represent war, but protection and sustenance. Together, they symbolized the courage to preserve and the strength to be gentle, a perfect balance of the two worlds he now comfortably inhabited. Their wedding was as simple and profound as the land itself. They stood on the banks of the creek, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow on the rustling cottonwood leaves. The whole town was there, along with Little Crow's people, a quiet, respectful gathering of two communities now joined as one. Their vows were not flowery words from a book, but short, true promises spoken from the heart. He promised to be her home. She promised to be his anchor. After they had spoken, Asha stepped forward. She took their hands, his left and her right, and gently tied a single, soft cord of braided red leather around their wrists, binding them together. "In our way," she said, her voice rich with the wisdom of generations. "Red is the color of the heart's blood. This cord does not bind you as prisoners. It reminds you that your hearts now beat as one." Then May, her own eyes glistening with tears, opened Evelyn's worn Bible. She did not read from the usual passages on marriage, but from the book of Micah, her voice clear and strong. "What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." The solemnity of the moment was broken by a sudden, loud fizzing sound, followed by a pop and a shower of sparks. Jessie, wanting to add a festive touch, had created a small, homemade firework out of paper and black powder. Unfortunately, his engineering was slightly off. A piece of the still smoldering paper landed on a dry bale of hay set up for seating, which promptly began to smolder. As a few of the women shrieked in alarm, Talon, without a moment's hesitation, calmly walked over, picked up a wet burlap sack that had been used to keep the lemonade cool, and decisively smothered the tiny fire. He then turned to Jessie, a rare, wide grin spreading across his face. The whole crowd, seeing the crisis so easily averted, erupted in a wave of laughter, a deep, cleansing sound that seemed to wash away the last lingering shadows of fear and hardship. The sound of that shared laughter was the real end of their long struggle. That night, the stars over Heart Creek seemed brighter, closer. The music and laughter from the bonfire faded into a gentle murmur. In the small, sturdy house that Talon had repaired, a single lamp burned. He led her inside, his touch gentle, reverent. The room was filled with a quiet sense of peace, of a journey's end and a new one's beginning. There was no fear, no hesitation. There was only a profound sense of rightness, of two souls who had fought their way through darkness and had finally, miraculously, found their way home. He looked at her, his eyes saying everything his words could not, and in her answering gaze, he saw his own love reflected, true and deep and abiding. The lamp was extinguished, and the small house on the bank of Heart Creek was enveloped in a soft, promising darkness, a sanctuary of trust and tenderness. The first light of the new day painted the prairie in shades of rose and gold. In the corral, a new life had just entered the world, a wobbly, long-legged foal nuzzling against its mother. Talon stood in the pale light, cradling the small, warm creature in his arms, its fuzzy coat soft against his buckskin shirt. He looked up as the door to the Heart House opened. Evelyn emerged, her face serene, her eyes bright with the promise of the new day. She walked not to him, but to the great barn doors. She slid the heavy bar aside and pulled them open, letting the morning light spill into the vast, clean space, ready for the new season, for the new life they would build together. Freedom is not a road of escape, but two people who dare to stand together. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.